This inner bore is just about 3 inches, it looks like, from whatever its former life was. And that's a pretty good size. But I was thinking, maybe I ought to bore that out a little bit bigger while I'm at it. Someday I may need to turn something bigger. Sure enough, if I make it 3, 6 months from now, I'll need to turn a piece that's 3.5. So there's some logic to saying, well, why not just make it the maximum that you'll ever need it? And that would be dictated by the swing over the cross slide. There's a handy chart here, and it says the swing over the saddle or over the cross slide is 4.3 inches. So you could never turn a piece larger in diameter than that. Might be an argument for increasing that inner bore out to 4 inches. Just thinking about the practicality of making this bore larger, it's 3 inches now, and there's, well, it's a little under 3 inches, I guess, because this piece of stock I think is nominally 3 inches, and it won't fit through the bore. It's a tight fit. So I might want to make this bore a little bit bigger, like maybe 3.25 or 3.5 inches, so that I know for sure that I can accommodate a piece of 3-inch diameter stock. So theoretically we could use stock up to 4.5 inches in diameter, or 4.25 I guess, and still have it pass over the cross slide. But the practical constraint is, as we saw earlier, when you get into stock 3 inches in diameter and more, you end up having to swing the compound around to this reverse angle in order to get the tool holder out far enough. So realistically, you're not going to turn stock that big anyway. I've swung the compound around so that it's parallel with the ways, and that's the point at which it has the maximum clearance from the workpiece. If you swing it this way or this way, anything other than that parallel configuration, it actually is closer in, and therefore is going to limit your stock size even more. So if you look at this, it's pretty apparent that the largest realistic piece of work that you're going to turn that's a long piece is going to be 3 inches, or maybe you might be able to get by with 3.5. But then when I put the tool holder in place, you can see that even 3 inches is probably a stretch. It's going to hit the backside, or pretty close to hitting the backside of the tool holder, and I can't get the tool at the correct angle. I guess the bottom line is I don't see much benefit in boring that hole out more than 3 inches, at least right now. And I guess if I ever needed it, because of the way this steady rest will be constructed, I could always take it apart and bore it out sometime in the future if I needed to. I may want to turn down this outer diameter. There's probably no reason it needs to be as large as it is, and at some point I'm going to need to put some screws in here, and unless I use really long screws, then it would be better if the diameter was smaller, so that these could meet in the middle, even for relatively small diameter stock. These bolts that I have are M4s. I want them to be able to come in ideally close enough to hold some 1/2 inch stock, although I'm not sure that I would use the steady rest for 1/2 inch stock, but maybe. But then I would have to have a pretty thin rim here. Of course, I could get longer bolts. These are the longest bolts I have available in the shop, I could always run out and buy some more. I was thinking that if I reduce the diameter down to about here, whatever that ends up being, then I could have a range of from 3/4 inches out to 3 inch diameter. Of course, if I needed to go smaller than that, I could always get longer bolts. I'd be willing to make a trip to the hardware store if that need came up at some point in the future. So I made a little Sharpie mark here, and then I'll measure that, and I think I'll go ahead and turn this down. I hope I'm not overlooking anything, because once you turn it down, there's no going back. I measured the mark from the center, and it's about 2¼ inches, so I think I'll just make this 4.5 inches outer diameter. I guess I may as well go ahead and do that now, because the next step of selecting a block for down here is going to depend on what diameter I end up with. I'm going to scribe a line at about the 4.5 inch diameter mark, a little bit beyond that, or a little bit larger than that, to use as a guideline when I remove this excess metal from the outside of the ring. Now there's two ways we can go about this. One way is to just start a turning operation beginning at the outside edge and keep turning till we reach that line and reduce this whole 3/4 inch outer ring here to a pile of chips. But there's another method that I'm going to try. It may or may not work because it's a little bit delicate, but it's a technique called trepanning. And with a trepanning operation, you use a tool to plunge directly into the work. And it cuts a narrow groove. Instead of converting this entire outer ring to chips, it cuts a narrow groove and actually cuts the outer ring out apart from the inner ring. If this outer ring is relatively wide, trepanning can save time just because you don't have to turn down all this excess material. You just need to make a narrow groove. When you're all done, you have a ring that could be used for some future project, and quite often I have actually taken advantage of that. But most of the trepanning I've done has been in thinner material. A lot of times I need a thin disc of acrylic plastic or something, and for that it works really well. Where you get into trouble is in a situation like this where the thickness of the material is pretty great relative to the width of the groove that you want to cut. This is the cutting tool that we'll use for the trepanning operation, and it's similar in shape and function, I guess, to a cutoff tool. If you look at it end on, you can see it's wider at the top. It's kind of a wedge shape, and that's to provide clearance on the sides for the chips to get out of the way. And then these two side edges and the top front edge are very sharp, and that's where the cutting actually occurs. I've rounded the bottom edge of the tool to help prevent it from getting wedged in the groove that it's already cut. If you're skilled, you can sometimes turn these in such a way that the actual cutting face is curved about the same radius as the groove you're cutting, but in this case I decided to make it simpler. This tool is not long enough to cut all the way through the disc. I started this actually with a longer and thinner version. I made it long enough to cut all the way through, but when I did some test cuts with it, I found that it was too limber and I was getting chatter and other problems. I made the length of the cutting tip on this tool just a little bit more than half of the thickness of the disc, so we can cut halfway through and then flip the disc over and cut the other half, but that allows us to have a much stiffer tool. These tools are made from 1/8 inch square high-speed steel tool blanks, and I like to use that material because it can be ground very quickly, and that's really all you need. But as you can see, it's way too small to clamp in the tool holder. The way we get around that is I made this sleeve, just milled some grooves into some aluminum, and then has a cap that fits on it, and then this clamps in the tool holder. The clamping screws provide pressure on the top of the tool to hold it in place. When it's ready to go, it looks something like this, but I found out on my initial test cuts that in this configuration it wasn't clamping tight enough because the tool's actually out here past where the screws are. I think the tool's slipping in the holder, so I had to flip it around and clamp it this way with the tool on the inside edge rather than the outside edge. In this configuration, the clamping screws are almost directly over top of the tool, so it clamps very tightly. I actually made this holder to go in my tool holder for my larger lathe, so it was made to be approximately 3/8 inch on a side. A little big for this tool holder for the mini lathe, but it works. I decided to put some ear protection on. This is a pretty loud, screechy sound. Well, it's making slow progress. I'm only using very light pressure on the hand wheel, But I think it will work. It's just going to take a while. Probably would have been faster just to turn it down the brute force way. But hey, then I wouldn't have this extra ring when I'm done, right? It seemed to like the higher spindle speed a little better, but we're still only maybe a fourth of the way through, no more than a third of the way through in any case. Well, the workpiece is not even really warm. It's a little bit warm, but not hot at all, so that's a good sign. It sort of gives me some confidence that we're cutting at a reasonable speed and depth and so forth, but it's just a slow process. I don't know if there's some better tool geometry that would improve it, you know, if I had some top brake on there, but who knows. Well, I'm going to work off camera for a while, and I'll come back later when I either flip it over to the other side or I break the tool bit off. So see you then. I stopped the lathe to check the depth of the cut, and I noticed when I was doing that the ring was actually a little bit loose on the chuck. I don't know whether the chuck jaws worked loose from the vibration or whether I never tightened them sufficiently before I started cutting, but after I retightened them I was able to make much better progress. So let's check the depth and see where we are. This is a little shop-made depth gauge. It's great for jobs like this. All it is a brass disc and a piece of 1/8 inch, or actually 1/16 inch drill rod, and then a little locking screw on there. There's a Teflon plug down in there to keep the screw from gouging the surface of the rod. I can hold that up to the side of the workpiece and I can see that we're pretty close to halfway through. I think I'll go just a little bit deeper and then we'll flip it over and come in from the other side. Alright, let's check the depth again. Yeah, we're definitely more than halfway through now. So time to flip the ring over. It's coming along pretty well. One thing that probably would improve this operation would be a cross slide lock, and I don't have one on the mini lathe. The mini lathe doesn't come with one. My larger lathe does have one, and it's very useful for operations like this where you want the cross slide to stay in a fixed position, and especially on a job like this where you have a lot of vibration that could cause the slide to shift and jam, you know, cause the tool to become wedged in there and break off. One way you could do that without making any modification is simply to tighten up the Gibs screws. And just while I touch this one with my finger, I noticed the nut's loose. The lock nut on this one is actually loose. I don't know whether that may be because of the vibration. There's a lot of vibration down here, and that may have been what worked that loose, or maybe it was loose before and I just didn't know it, but that seems unlikely. The Gibs screw itself is loose too, so I'm going to tighten that up, and hopefully the others are okay. But I don't want to change the position of the carriage in order to get them, or that will move the position of our tool in the groove and could cause the tool to break off. Okay, now I'm getting ready to plunge into the opposite face. Oops. Well, you know, things happen. Yeah, obviously what happened there is the vibration caused the chuck to work loose. Interestingly, when you're clamping on a ring like this, and I'm sure most of you know this, you actually have to clamp by opening the jaws so that it tightens up on the ring. But fundamentally, I don't see why that would make any difference as long as I have it tight. I'll give it a little bit more torque this time. try again. Okay, we're essentially through. I suspect there are a few strands of aluminum still holding it together, but there we go. All in all, I guess I'll call that success. It took longer than I hoped, but anyway, I think it was an interesting way to go about it, and now I have this extra ring I can use for some future project. I want to clean up the chips, but before I do that, there's a razor sharp edge here, which I'm touching right where these two cuts came together in the middle there. So I want to take a regular tool and cut that off before I slice my hand on it. I may end up having to turn the compound back in its backward pointing configuration in order to get the clearance I need. Getting the tool out far enough to turn this edge sometimes can be a little exercise in itself. Well, the cross slide is all the way back, and as you can see, I'm nowhere close. I'm probably 3/4 of an inch or maybe even an inch away from this edge that I need to get to, but I have a tool that may do the job. When I got my first mini lathe back in 1999, it was a Harbor Freight 7x10. One of the limitations I ran into quickly was I needed to turn the outer edge of some discs that were close to 6 inches in diameter, and I made this little tool to do that. And you clamp it down using the regular screw, and I guess on this lathe it needs a spacer here. I've moved the tool bit all the way back in here, and you can see this is really simple. You could make one yourself. You just put a drill bit in the chuck, drill the hole through. The only thing is you need to use a square drill bit in order to get this square hole to hold the tool. With the compound set parallel to the ways, I still don't have quite enough clearance, so I had to angle this tool holder back a little bit. So it's kind of an ugly tool geometry, but it'll get the job done, I think, and I don't feel like going to the trouble of angling the compound again if I don't need to. So let's try it and see what happens. First, I'm just going to try to take off that sharp ring. Okay, and now with that gone, I'll just take a couple of turning cuts on there. I'm just feeding this by hand, but I can use power feed, and I think I'll take one more pass, or maybe more than one pass. I just noticed I'm on the edge of these screw holes here, so I may want to, I'll probably want to turn it down enough to get past those holes. I'm going to take one more cut on here and use the power feed. The pulsing sound you're hearing is because of that screw hole. What I'm finding is when I withdraw the carriage to bring the tool back, it's cutting on the reverse pass, and I think the reason is that this tool holder is actually kind of springy, and I think during the first cut it's springing out, and then on the way back it's springing in and cutting on this backward pass. I've already got the cross slide out as far as it will go, so I can't bring it back to get any more clearance, although it could just adjust the angle of the tool again, I guess. Maybe I'll do that. give it a little more clearance this way. You can see, in spite of the difficulties, when all was said and done, it made a reasonably nice finish on there. We ended up right at 4.5 inches, which was what I was shooting for. But I think I'm going to turn that down. I don't like the idea of leaving this rough edge here, but the alternative is I could just fill that in with some epoxy material and then take another turning cut on here to smooth it off. I think I'll break for lunch and maybe think about that for a while and decide what to do. You may have noticed that the lathe at some points as I was feeding in was struggling a little bit to maintain speed and torque. This lathe is the Little Machine Shop model 5100, and it has the HiTorque brushless DC motor. So these lathes with that motor typically have quite a lot more torque than the less expensive models that have the classic brush type DC motors. Now over the years, even the ones with the brush type motors have gotten much better. I think the power supplies have improved a lot. So if you have one of these lathes that does not have the brushless DC motor, a cutting operation like we did with the trepanning tool may bog down your lathe. You can usually overcome that just by taking lighter cuts, so the job takes longer, but you can get it done. What happens is that as the diameter of the workpiece increases, you have essentially a lever arm out here. As that diameter increases, the torque increase, or the torque that the motor has to provide increases with the distance.